I don't know if this belongs here, but I've carried it around for so long that it feels heavier than the crime itself. My name's William. I'm not looking for sympathy, and I'm definitely not trying to convince anyone I was secretly a good person. I made a choice that hurt people. I planned it. I followed through. And for years I convinced myself there wasn't another way. There was. The title probably sounds dramatic, but it isn't. There was a message sitting in my phone typed out, never sent. Just a few sentences. If I'd hit send, none of what I'm about to tell you would have happened. No theft. No lies. No police. No nights spent staring at the ceiling wondering where my life split into a before and an after. Instead, I locked my phone, put it back in my pocket, and decided I'd solve my problems myself. That decision turned into the biggest crime of my life. At the time, I was 29, buried in debt I couldn't realistically repay. It wasn't one bad investment or one unlucky break. It was years of bad decisions stacked on top of each other until I could barely breathe under the weight of them. Credit cards, personal loans, gambling that started as harmless fun and slowly became desperation disguised as hope. I kept telling everyone I was fine. I wasn't. Then I learned something I never should have known about the company where I worked. Something that looked less like an opportunity and more like an escape. That's where this story really begins. The message sat in my drafts for almost an hour. Can we talk? I'm in serious trouble. I need help before I do something stupid. It was addressed to my older brother. We hadn't spoken much in the previous year after a pointless argument about money and pride. I convinced myself he'd ignore me, or worse, tell me that I'd made my own mess and should deal with it alone. Looking back, I never gave him the chance to prove me wrong. Instead of pressing send, I deleted the last sentence, rewrote it twice, then locked my phone. That tiny decision felt insignificant. It wasn't. The next morning I walked into work pretending everything was normal. I smiled at coworkers, joked over coffee, answered emails. Inside, though, I was doing math every minute: how much I owed, how many days until another payment bounced, how long before someone came looking for me. That's when I noticed something I'd overlooked before. Our office handled large cash deposits from several retail locations. Most employees only saw summaries, but because of my position, I could see the schedules, the pickup times, and the security routines. The system wasn't exactly vulnerable, but it wasn't perfect either. I didn't immediately think, I'm going to steal it. I told myself I was only looking. That's the lie every bad decision seems to start with. Over the next couple of weeks, curiosity quietly turned into obsession. I stopped seeing the cash transfer schedule as part of my job and started looking at it like it was a puzzle waiting to be solved. Every delivery followed nearly the same routine. The armored pickup always arrived within a predictable window, and there was a brief period when the deposit bag sat in a secure room with only a handful of employees nearby. I never forced myself to think, I'm going to do this. Instead, I kept asking hypothetical questions. What if someone wanted to take one bag? What if the cameras had blind spots? What if a delay looked like an ordinary mistake? Each answer made the impossible seem a little more realistic. At home, I filled pages of a notebook with rough sketches of the office layout, employee schedules, and timing estimates. I even threw the notebook away twice, only to dig it back out of the trash a day later. The strangest part is that I still believed I was a decent person. I wasn't planning violence or revenge. I kept telling myself it would be a victimless crime, that the company had insurance, that nobody would really suffer. Those excuses made it easier to keep planning. They also made it much harder to recognize the person I was becoming. Once I had convinced myself the idea was possible, I started preparing in ways that felt small enough to ignore. I volunteered for shifts that gave me access to the secure room more often. Nobody questioned it because I had always been reliable. In fact, my manager thanked me for being flexible, and hearing that almost made me stop. Almost. I paid closer attention to the security cameras, not to disable them, but to understand what they actually covered. I memorized who took long lunch breaks, who chatted in the hallway, and who rushed through their tasks without double-checking anything. I wasn't hacking systems or picking locks. I was simply learning routines, and that somehow made the whole thing feel less like a crime in my head. Every night I rehearsed different scenarios. If someone walked in unexpectedly, I'd pretend I was organizing paperwork. If anyone asked why I was in the room, I'd already have an answer ready. The more I prepared, the calmer I became, which should have terrified me. One evening my brother called. I watched his name appear on my screen and let it ring until it stopped. A minute later he sent a short text asking if everything was okay. I never replied. That was the second message that could have changed everything. The morning I chose wasn't random. It was the end of the month, when the office was unusually busy and everyone seemed focused on deadlines instead of each other. I'd been waiting for the right combination of distractions, and that day checked every box. By the time I walked through the front doors, my heart was already racing, even though I tried to act like it was just another Thursday. I had barely slept the night before. I kept imagining two completely different futures. In one, I walked away with enough money to erase my debts and start over. In the other, I was handcuffed before sunset. Somehow, I convinced myself the first outcome was more likely. Around lunchtime, I noticed the familiar rhythm unfolding exactly as I expected. Employees moved between departments, phones rang non-stop, and people hurried past without making eye contact. Everything looked ordinary, and that was exactly why I believed my plan could work. Standing outside the secure room, I reached into my pocket and felt my phone. My brother's unread message was still there. For a second, I almost opened it. Instead, I slipped the phone back into my pocket, took a deep breath, and reached for the door handle. The room was quieter than I expected. I could hear the low hum of the air conditioner and the muffled conversations from the hallway outside. For a few seconds I simply stood there, staring at the deposit bags on the shelf. They looked so ordinary that it was almost ridiculous to think they were about to change my life. My hands were shaking as I carried out the plan I had rehearsed countless times. I moved carefully, making sure not to attract attention, constantly listening for footsteps. Every sound made my pulse jump. I kept telling myself to stay calm, that I only had to get through the next few minutes. Then something happened that I hadn't planned for. A coworker started walking toward the room much earlier than usual. I heard the door handle move, and my entire body froze. Somehow, I managed to greet him casually and give a believable explanation for why I was there. He accepted it without much thought, apologized for interrupting, and left. The moment the door closed again, I realized just how close everything had come to falling apart. I should have stopped right there. Instead, I finished what I had started and walked out, pretending nothing had happened. The hardest part wasn't walking out of the room, it was acting normal afterward. I returned to my desk, answered emails, laughed at a joke someone made in the break room, and even joined a meeting that felt completely meaningless. Every minute stretched forever. I was convinced everyone could hear my heartbeat or see the panic written across my face. When my shift finally ended, I left the building at the same pace as everyone else. I fought the urge to look over my shoulder. The moment I reached my car, the adrenaline hit me all at once. My hands were trembling so badly that I had to sit there for several minutes before I could even start the engine. Driving home, I kept expecting flashing police lights to appear behind me. Every car that followed me for more than a block felt suspicious. Every traffic light seemed to last forever. But nothing happened. That silence was the most dangerous part. It convinced me I'd gotten away with it. By the time I unlocked my apartment door, I actually believed the worst was over. I had no idea the real consequences hadn't even begun the next morning. The office felt different the second I walked in. People weren't chatting over coffee like they usually did. Small groups stood together, speaking in low voices, and every conversation stopped the moment someone else walked past. I didn't have to ask what had happened. I already knew. Within an hour, management announced that money had gone missing and everyone would need to cooperate with an internal investigation. Hearing those words out loud made my stomach drop. I forced myself to look surprised, asking the same questions everyone else did. but inside I was already imagining prison walls closing around me. Then I saw my coworker, the one who had briefly interrupted me the day before. He looked nervous, almost guilty. Later I overheard him telling his supervisor that he'd been one of the last people near the secure room. That hit me harder than I expected. For the first time since the theft, I realized someone else might pay for what I'd done. I told myself the investigation would reveal the truth eventually. Still, I said nothing. I stood there, listening as suspicion quietly settled on an innocent person, and I hated myself for remaining silent. From that day on, my life became a chain of lies. Every conversation felt like a test I hadn't studied for. Detectives and company investigators interviewed everyone separately, asking the same questions in slightly different ways. They weren't aggressive, but they were patient. That was somehow worse. When it was my turn, I answered calmly. I repeated the timeline I'd memorized, mentioned the meeting I'd attended, and described the afternoon as if it had been completely ordinary. I even looked people in the eye because I'd read somewhere that avoiding eye contact made you seem suspicious. The lies worked, for the moment. But outside the interview room, the office was falling apart. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some people blamed management, others suspected employees who had been struggling financially. My coworker, the one who had unknowingly walked in on me, became the center of whispered conversations. I watched him grow quieter every day, avoiding the break room and eating lunch alone. I wanted to tell someone the truth more than once. I even opened my phone and started typing a confession. Just like before, I never pressed send. That unsent message became another weight I chose to carry instead of facing the consequences. A few weeks passed, and on the surface it looked like I'd escaped. No one came to arrest me. My name never came up in meetings. The investigators kept working, but the urgency faded as the days slipped by. Friends even joked that the company would probably never figure out what had happened. I laughed with them. It was the most dishonest laugh of my life. The money I'd stolen sat hidden where I could barely bring myself to look at it. I'd imagined paying off every debt the moment I got it, but now every bill felt contaminated. Every dollar reminded me of the person I had become. Instead of freedom, the money brought a constant sense of dread. Then I heard that my coworker had been suspended while the investigation continued. There wasn't enough evidence to charge him with anything, but the company said they needed to protect the integrity of the process. I remember sitting alone in my apartment after hearing that news. The room was silent except for my phone vibrating on the table. It was another message from my brother. "Whatever's going on, you don't have to face it alone." I read those words over and over. And once again, I didn't answer. I wish I could say guilt finally made me confess, but that isn't how it happened. The truth began catching up to me long before I was ready to face it. Small details I thought I'd hidden suddenly seemed important. Security footage was reviewed again. Access logs were checked more carefully. Investigators started asking follow-up questions instead of repeating the old ones. The atmosphere at work became unbearable. Every time my phone rang, I expected it to be the police. Every email from human resources made my chest tighten. I stopped sleeping through the night, waking up convinced someone was knocking on my door. The worst part was seeing my suspended coworker come back to collect his belongings. He wasn't angry. He just looked exhausted. As he packed the few personal items from his desk, he quietly told another employee that he didn't know how he was going to explain everything to his family. Those words stayed with me. For the first time, I realized the real damage wasn't measured in money. It was measured in trust, reputations, and lives I disrupted. The theft had ended in minutes, but the consequences were still growing, and they were finally heading in my direction. About a month after the theft, there was a knock on my apartment door just after sunrise. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but the sound made my stomach sink. I'd imagined that moment so many times that it almost felt familiar. When I opened the door, 2 investigators were standing there. They were calm and polite. One of them asked if we could talk about the events surrounding the missing company funds. I already knew pretending to be surprised wouldn't help, but I did it anyway. They didn't accuse me immediately. Instead, they mentioned inconsistencies in the access records and asked why my timeline didn't fully match the electronic logs. Then they told me they'd recovered additional security footage from another area of the building. I felt every excuse I'd rehearsed collapsing in my head. For several minutes I tried to explain, to fill the silence with harmless details, but the more I talked, the less convincing I sounded. Eventually I stopped speaking altogether. That silence said more than any confession could have. As they looked at me, I realized the one thing I'd feared for weeks had finally happened. There was nowhere left to hide, from them or from myself. I don't remember exactly what I said first. I only remember how exhausted I felt. Weeks of pretending, lying, and looking over my shoulder had drained me more than I realized. When the investigators asked one final time if there was anything I wanted to add, I stared at the floor for what felt like forever. Then I admitted it. Not because I expected forgiveness. Not because I thought it would erase the damage. I confessed because I couldn't carry the weight of the lies any longer. Once I started talking, everything came off: the debts, the planning, the stolen money, and every excuse I'd invented to justify what I'd done. One investigator listened without interrupting. The others simply took notes. The hardest part wasn't describing the theft. It was admitting that an innocent coworker had suffered because I had chosen to stay silent. That truth hurt more than anything else. After my statement, I handed over the remaining money. Seeing it leave my hands brought no sense of loss. If anything, it was a strange relief. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't hiding. I was finally facing the consequences I had spent so much energy trying to avoid. The legal process took months, but emotionally it felt much longer. Every hearing forced me to relive the decisions that had brought me there. My confession and cooperation mattered, and the innocent coworker was fully cleared, but none of that erased what he had been through. I apologized to him once, face to face. He listened quietly, thanked me for finally telling the truth, and walked away. I understood. Some damage doesn't disappear just because you admit causing it. Losing my job was only the beginning. Friends stopped calling, relatives looked at me differently, and rebuilding trust proved far harder than rebuilding my finances. Ironically, the debt that had pushed me toward the theft would have been easier to solve than the shame I carried afterward. During those months, I kept thinking about that unfinished message to my brother. When I finally showed it to him, he didn't criticize me. He simply asked why I hadn't trusted him enough to send it. I never had a good answer. That question still echoes in my mind more than any courtroom sentence ever could. It's been years since all of this happened, and I still think about how differently my life could have turned out. People often imagine that one huge decision changes everything, but that's not what happened to me. My life unraveled because of a series of small choices, each one easier to justify than the last. The biggest mistake wasn't even the theft itself. It was believing I had to face my problems alone. I still have a screenshot of that first unsent message. I kept it as a reminder that pride can be more dangerous than desperation. A few honest words to someone who cared about me might have saved my job, my reputation, and a completely innocent person from weeks of fear and suspicion. If you've read this far, don't take my story as an excuse or a search for sympathy. Take it as a warning. When you're drowning in debt, shame, or fear, your mind will start telling you that you have no good options. That's a lie. Talk to someone. Ask for help. Send the message. Because sometimes, the difference between rebuilding your life and destroying it is only a few words that never leave your phone.